By far, the hardest thing that I've created in City Skylines isn't even city related. It's instead this giant wetland that I created for my Sunset City series. It's one of my all-time favorite things that I've built in City Skylines, and today I'm going to be talking about how I made it, the techniques that I used, why it was so difficult to make in the first place, and also showing you around some of the fun little details that I've added. But first up, if you're new here and like what you see, well, probably a great time to subscribe and follow along because we've only just started Sunset City. This is a series based on the state of Florida, and this is, of course, a wetland based on the massive wetland of the Everglades. So if you're unfamiliar with this area, this is the Everglades National Park. It's an absolutely massive wetland that takes up a big chunk of the southern parts of Florida. But just to call it a wetland is a real understatement because there is a lot of different types of environments in this area, which is a big reason why I wanted to build this area in the first place. I'm really fascinated by large, untouched natural environments, and although the Everglades is hardly untouched these days, there are pockets of areas that are very, very remote, and I wanted to give it a crack in City Skylines. I wanted to see if we could create a place and a natural environment that felt really untouched. I wanted to show how the natural environment was created, show how the trees and wildlife have adapted to the area, the different types of areas within this wetland, the remoteness of places, the impact of urbanization, and the people who decide to live within this natural environment. But before I ramble too much, I can already feel myself doing it. I want to know from you guys, do you live near the Everglades? Or have you been here before? Or is this a place you've always wanted to visit? I'm merely an outsider looking in, so any ideas and suggestions and experiences from you guys are going to help me out as we continue to work around this area. Well, probably one of the hardest parts about making the wetlands on the map was figuring out where it was going to sit in the first place. I already talk quite a lot about that in the first episode of Sunset City, so rather than going over old ground, I'll start by talking about the map theme. So of course, to create an environment like this, I needed to use the map theme mixer mod, which allows me to mix in a bunch of different map themes to create the perfect type of color settings and different textures that I needed to create the wetlands and all the different other types of environments in this area. What I ended up settling for was the ore brush to be a dark green so I could place under large groups of trees to create a little bit of extra depth. I made the fertile land brown so that we could create some muddy areas. And then my all-time favorite, the one that ended up being the most handy, was the oil brush. The thing that was giving me the most strife when creating the wetlands was trying to create lots of texture in the ground, lots of small shrubs and twigs and leaves and just ground matter. Originally I was trying to achieve the same thing with placing down bushes and little trees and grass, and the prop limit and the tree limit was just getting dangerously close and the effect just wasn't really achieved. So I knew that it was somewhere in the map theme that I could just tweak or just find the perfect balance. I ended up finding an oil theme that I was able to increase the texture of using the map theme mixer mod, and I was able to achieve that bushy ground matter that I'd always wanted this. I'd always wanted a map theme that was able to create this. And with that, I was able to create these very textured landscapes without having to place down huge amounts of bushes and props, even though I do that in other areas, which we'll get to in a little while. But moving to the very first environment that we created as part of our wetlands, we are starting at the very bottom, and we are starting with the network of rivers leading into our mangroves. And these mangroves then lead into this ocean, or I guess you could say move into this bay as part of the Seminole Keys. In real life Everglades, this place is pretty interesting. It looks super beautiful. Let me know if you've been here. But we have a whole bunch of sandbanks. It looks like fairly shallow water and lots of little islands, lots of little beaches, and just pristine, beautiful, clear water, at least Google Earth wise. The first step was to create the little islands and figure out the shape of this place, what it was going to look like, trying to include as many islands as possible, but also not overcrowding it. So it's a real scale challenge, trying to figure out the right amount, but also not going overboard. I wanted to include a bunch of sandbanks and islands that were creating a bit of a barrier for this area so that we've got this shallow water that is being, I guess, created from this sandbank. And then a little later, you'll see me create just little channels in the sandbanks or underneath the water, just so you can see how that has influenced some of these small islands. I'm using my sand technique of getting the biggest brush and scaling down the strength of it, and then creating just big circles so that I can just tailor that sandbank really nicely, trying to make just little differences in the types of sand in these areas, which then allows me to create those little channels that I was talking about. First, I am creating those channels with the sand, and then I'll go through and change it with the landscape, because doing the sand is the harder part, and then doing it with the actual landscape isn't that hard. So I like to start with the hardest thing first, and then doing the easier technique afterwards. Once I finished those little channels, I started to place some trees on top of some of the islands, not on all of them, but just a couple of them. And then even going ahead and placing down some small shrubs and some grass decals underneath, just to give it a little bit of extra detail. Once I'd finished the islands, I wanted to move on to some of the windy rivers that lead into the bay. These were going to be a whole network of different types of I guess little lakes and little pools of water, and mostly just a network of rivers that are leading from the wetlands into this area. This is one of the more easier areas to detail because, essentially I'm just covering it in mangroves, and I decided to go with some very low poly trees because I wanted to use a whole bunch of them, and I didn't want to, completely tank the already tanking FPS. And just quickly on performance, I am going for a real mix of different techniques. So for instance, I'm doing detailed in areas, and in other aspects, I am keeping it pretty simple. So for example, when it comes to some of the islands are a little bit detailed. Some of those little tiny islands where I'm placing decals and some props just to create some extra shrubbery. But then when it comes to the trees, I am being really careful with the types of trees that I'm using. They're usually pretty low detail. And then in other areas where I want there to be a little bit of extra detail, then I'll use some better looking trees, or I'll place down some extra props. And I'm gonna be honest, the performance of this is not too bad, but I did want to really test my computer out, and I wasn't holding back quite as much as I usually do on other maps that I've created. After creating a bunch of remote beaches and adding in those extra little bits of detail, it was time to move on from one of the easier builds to one of the more challenging ones. My first attempt at creating the wetlands was a step in the right direction, but ultimately it was a bit of a fail. I was trying to create a very small windy river, just a whole network of very small windy rivers that I could fill up with a bit of water and then have this slow moving body of water, because essentially that's what the Everglades is. It's a very slow moving river, massive slow moving river, and there is just this constant flow of water that I wanted to achieve. But if you ever worked with water at a very low volume in City Skylines, you'll know that it's quite challenging. It doesn't really work that way. So this was my first attempt. It was okay, but ultimately I realized after this that I probably needed to just have a bit of a placeholder here for the time being, and then once I placed the more detailed areas on the fringe of the wetlands, then I could get a bit of a sense of where roads are going to impact this area and how the network of rivers was going to influence some of the other areas that are just off the wetland. And basically the problem was it was looking more like a river than a giant grassland, which meant that I needed to add in some extra detail into this area, which I didn't realize at this time. I was just trying to, create the water in this area and thinking that the ground texture of the map theme was going to work its magic. But in reality, the water was poking out like a sore thumb, and I really needed the water to be, a little bit more discreet. You couldn't really see it in areas, of course, but in other areas, it was just there, but you couldn't really see it. Something that was working though were these little tree islands that I was creating. The Everglades have these little pockets of trees that are known as tree islands, and they're essentially just little pockets of trees, larger trees that I believe are slightly raised up or a little bit higher up, or there's something going on that allow them to grow within these areas. So I was trying to create that, but with a lack of other trees around this area, they were just not working. So I decided to put a pin in the detail work of the wetland and instead drag out a couple of roads, seeing what the highway would look like as it stretched across this area. One of my favorite things about these big natural environments is the sense of journey as you travel across or travel through these areas. And the Everglades have these big highways, these long highways that stretch across the wetlands, going through a whole bunch of different types of environments, stretching from the cities to other little towns to smaller remote places and to the national park. I love these big open drives, these big journeys as you travel from one place to another, and I want to create something similar in Sunset City. So, stretching from the city are two highways. This is the first of which that stretches towards this little town, this town that I wanted to be nestled into this tall cypress forest, which is very different to the rest of the area around here. But if the Everglades can do it, then damn it, I'm gonna give it a red hot go. First things first, I apologize about the color change. For some reason, I thought that this was going to be the color settings for Sunset City, but man, this looks so bad looking back at it. But for some reason, I was really digging the way that this was looking, but it's definitely not good, and I will be changing it a little later on in this episode. But unfortunately, it gets worse before it gets better. So yeah, sorry about the massively bright settings that you're about to see. But this area is inspired, of course, by the tall cypress forest of Everglades. This place is so cool. I love these big tall trees, these big tall cypress trees. They're super unique, super interesting, and I want to create something similar. But the challenge was, how do I create this area that is so different to the other areas of the wetlands? And decided that we needed some sort of like barrier between the two areas. And on other maps, I would probably make a mountain or a hill, but because this is completely flat, I decided to add in an extra river that was this barrier between the two. And basically you travel across the river and then you are met with this tall cypress forest and this pretty different landscape to the rest of the wetlands. I tried a bunch of techniques to create this area. First up, I placed down all the trees and then was creating a bunch of one-year rivers that were feeding into this area. That didn't really work, so then I tried a couple of network rivers that also didn't really work. It was trying a whole bunch of things. It just was not coming out the way that I envisioned it. I was trying to achieve more of a swamp than anything else, and I think creating these rivers just wasn't really working. But I decided to do something a bit different and work on a bit of the detail work along this riverbank, creating some of these little reeds and putting in a bit more detail. And it was about this time that I realized that in order to achieve the effect that I wanted, I was going to have to put in a lot more detail than I expected. I wasn't going to just get through some of these areas by putting in, the bare minimal, trying to save FPS or trying to save time. It was only going to work if I put in the detail work. It was at about this time that I realized that it was the color of the water. It was far too bright. It was far too blue for a swampland. I mean, it probably took me too long to realize this, but I got there in the end. The problem is that I'd been working around the ocean, which is quite tropical, and I wanted it to be very vibrant blue, but in the swampland, in the wetlands, it needed to be a different color. So I decided that the only way that this is going to work is if I had a color setting for the ocean and then a color setting for the wetland. And the wetland color was going to be a much darker and a much browner color, whereas the ocean is going to be that beautiful turquoise blue. And then I just switched between the two depending on what I was looking at, saving both of them, pretty much just saving both of them as Sunset City Blue and then Sunset City Brown. And I just switched between the two depending on what we were working on. And the color settings for the wetlands ended up being a lot darker bluish color than a brown color. It was really convenient just switching between the two. It's a shame that we can't have more than one color unless you're, I guess, changing the watercolor with the polluted water, but I think that this works a lot better. It means you can just tailor it the way that you want it to, and with that, I just started to place down the trees and the little shrubs underneath and the grass and just all that little bits of detail around this water, around this body of water. And it was, really coming together. I was really liking this effect. Even though the color settings are really off, when I finally get the color settings right, it looks pretty sweet. I decided to start mixing in some palm trees. We add in a bit of detail around the roads, and I was really loving the look of the growth underneath these cypress trees. I think this area was coming together really nicely. So then I decided to start working on just the bare bones for what the town shape is going to look like, where some of the roads are going to go and what it might eventually turn out like. And I mean, this is essentially all I've got for this area. If you've got any ideas of what this town should be, or ideas of what it could look like, please let me know, because I'm actually really excited to start working over here, and I think we're going to create some really cool, just a really cool backstory for what this place is like. It's going to be one of the first towns you will meet on your way out or into Sunset City, and it is on this small little highway, so a much smaller highway than some of the other highways that are stretching towards the other cities or the other places we'll be building. But yeah, I think it's going to make for some pretty nice little road trips. I started to mix in some other types of trees, like some weeping willows and some different types of palm trees, and just some like big trees that are going to be around this area. Like these ones are more detailed than some of the other trees in other areas, but this is going to be a pretty detailed area, as you can already imagine. And if you're wondering about the color of the trees, because some of them are pretty different to some of the other trees that are in this area, it's the color settings. It's totally the color settings. I actually messaged Mr. Mason, which are pretty much all these trees that I'm using, these amazingly detailed swampy trees. I love them so much, and the color was just a bit off, but they are quite old. They're one of his older assets, and I even messaged him and I was like, oh, hey man, like any chance you're interested in updating some of these old trees? And he was polite enough to be like, yeah, sure, I'll be happy to. And then I realized it's totally my color settings. It was my problem on my end. So I totally apologize for that. And yeah, they look awesome and they work really well in this area. And you just went to change my color settings, so it looks far better than what it does at the moment. But this area really got the detailed treatment, and I think that it really brought this place alive. You know, the idea is that when it comes to building this place, I mean, it's already detailed, and I am kind of just keen just to place in a couple of houses, even over the next couple of episodes, and start adding in those, that urban development into this area, because it already has a bit of that. It just needs some houses and a little bit of farming, and thinking about what this place is going to look like, what its purpose is, and who might live here, and what it could be called. It's all that sort of stuff is yet to come. But with all the detail work in, I continued the highway across the water, stretching away from Sunset City, and decided to go back to our wetland, to our grassland, and give it another crack, because I was feeling pretty good about this area. I felt like things were in place and the ball's rolling, and I realized that if this wetland was ever going to come alive, I was going to have to detail it up and spend a bit of time getting that happening. So I revisited the river idea, thinking that the river was the one feeding into the swampland and feeding into this wetland too, and was putting in the detail work, just putting in some reeds and some swamp props and some other big props like that, and these tree islands as well on these higher up areas. But the problem is that there was like a really big difference between the texture of the ground and then the trees and props that I was placing down as well. And I was realizing that, this was going to be an okay effect, but I really wanted this whole area to feel like a grassland, and this was not really working, that type of detail work, this patchy detail work. So I knew that at some point I was going to have to connect it all up using some sort of grass prop. I mean, there's plenty of them on the Steam Workshop, so I knew that was going to come at some point, but I was still just putting in little patches here and there and merge them at some point. That's sort of what the idea was. But then I also realized that I had a bit of extra space for another highway stretching towards our little town here, and decided to upgrade our other one, our smaller highway, and make a even smaller highway that stretches a little bit closer to the mangroves. So then we've got these two areas. We've got this one that goes through a little bit more of a developed area. It's got a couple of little channels too, which I'm going to talk a bit more about the channels later on. And then we've got one that's a bit more remote. I reckon you'd see pretty much no one driving on that road unless you're a tourist or if you're driving to one of the locations that are around this area. I continued to detail these rivers and I continued the road stretching all around the wetland, and as I was working on it, the landscape around in the Seminole State was just transforming just constantly. It was a constantly changing landscape and influencing the way that this wetland was taking shape. With a pretty good idea of where a lot of the natural features are going to sit within the wetlands, I decided to start working on some of the human impact of this area. Starting with, well, of course, we've already got the highways, but I then wanted to start working on some of the many channels that stretch around this area. And this is, of course, inspired by a lot of the channels that sit in the Everglades. I believe this has got something to do with funneling water into particular areas and also for flood control. I'm sure there's other purposes behind this, but I just think these things look super interesting. I mean, they're pretty ugly, but I just always find that these man-made rivers, these man-made canals, are always so interesting when it comes to the way that they're used and the way that they look amongst a natural environment that is, you know, so natural in so many instances, and then you've got these straight lines, so they look so unusual. My first attempt with this was to try and use the network rivers. These are awesome assets, but they weren't really working in this context because I needed something that looked a little bit more natural, and I was also using very low flowing water, so I needed something that was going to allow a little bit of very low water going through. I love the look of these things as they stretch alongside the highways, and I wanted them to flow into other larger bodies of water, but then also channeling away from the city and going into some of these basins as well. I ended up changing the technique from using these network rivers to instead using this invisible network tool, which then allows me to lower the land, and I can place a few of them around each other so that we've got this sharp edge, and they do create this really nice sharp edge that I can also place a lot of shrubs and grass and all sorts of things around, because I wanted these things to be pretty overgrown and nice and detailed. Just think that that's a really nice looking effect. And speaking of grass, you can probably tell that we are using a ton of grass for our wetlands. I realized that the way that this was going to come together was if I was to mix together a bunch of these grass props and shrubs and different types of trees. I think creating that texture, you know, just having that ground texture as part of the map theme was nice from a distance, but ultimately up close it really just was lacking a lot of depth. So I needed these grass props, even though that I had to cover such a huge amount of space with them. My technique was to find the lower poly grass props that I could find. In fact, I probably searched through every single grass prop there was on the Steam Workshop, and there's a bunch of winning ones, but I was essentially trying to go for ones that were fairly large, that covered a great big chunk of land, finding ones that had pretty good LODs so that when I zoomed out, they were looking pretty decent. And the cool thing is that I can zoom out and they will disappear and it still looks pretty nice. But then if I get up nice and close, all that really nice detailed stuff is all there. But I decided to do this not for the entire wetland, but for a pretty good chunk of it, at least close to the city where we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at. And then other areas are lower detailed. So if you're seeing me place out a whole bunch of stuff, don't worry too much. It's it's not as detailed as that. But in saying that, it is still a very detailed map, one of my more detailed ones, if it is my most detailed map for sure. But I figured, I've got a decent PC, I need to really utilize it. And I think the way that I'm planning on spreading out the city and the types of stuff we're going to be building, I actually don't think it's going to be too bad. But as you can see, lots of detail, lots of intricacies. I really love just placing down those natural features and thinking about where they sit. Also placing down or creating different types of detailed environments within these areas. So we've got some more flowery types of areas with lily pads and palm trees. And then we've got other areas further up the road where we've got a lot more bare trees, lacking any foliage at all, and just totally different types of environments within this swampland. So it's really just not a massive grassy field. It is also got quite a lot of different details in there, which you'll be able to explore yourself when I finally upload the map. Give me another month, and then I want to introduce it to you guys slowly, and then you guys can fly around and check out these places for yourselves. Once I'd figured out the technique, it was just a matter of applying the same thing in other areas. So continuing the grassy wetlands and continuing some of the winding rivers, we've got more roads stretching in other directions, and thinking about what the farmland on the fringe of the Everglades, not the Everglades, the Patana wetlands, which is what we're calling this area, what's that impact? How is it affecting it? And also, how far we're going to stretch into that area. I'm actually looking forward to creating these into real farms rather than just ones that are created with the environment. It was at this point that I decided that I needed to create some sort of large body of water in the middle of the map. So that's where our lake was created, and that's the lake that feeds into our wetlands and feeds into the swampland and then goes into the mangroves down below. So we've got this whole flow-on effect as it stretches all the way through the map, and I'm really happy with that because that's something that I was really pushing towards. And more detail around the roads, introducing lots of different types of trees, different tree species around where people are, and then where people are less, we've got more of the same types of trees because it's more of the natural environment that was originally there, whereas people spread seeds and plant trees along roadsides. So that's why we've got more bushiness and way more types of trees in those sort of areas. And look, I guess that's pretty much it for how I created the wetlands. It was a pretty mammoth thing. It took a bloody long time. I definitely overthought this, but I really enjoyed making it. I really enjoy making these natural environments, and there's still so much more I could talk about, but I think a lot of it's going to come out as we continue this series, and when you guys get to explore the map for yourselves, which shouldn't be too much further of a wait. But there is one special feature that I saved to last that I wanted to show you guys. It is, I really like this. It was a bit of an accident, but it worked out pretty well. So because of the nature of wetlands, you have a very low body of water within these areas, but you can't really achieve that in City Skylines. Well, by resetting the water to sea level and hitting pause, you can get that very low body of water through this whole area. So you can have essentially high tide and low tide for these areas and have that real low-lying water effect, which I think makes it look so much better. It's just a shame that it drains out as soon as you hit play, but I think it's a pretty cool effect, and I've definitely taken a couple of cinematics like this, as you can see from the cinematics you're watching right now. But guys, thank you all so much for watching today's episode of Sunset City, even though we didn't build a city. We will be next week, and I really can't wait to get back into it. So yeah, look forward to that one. Big thanks to the wonderful people over on Patreon who are supporting the channel. Liam, Simon Verhade, Tyler Smith, Lawrence Pitts, Lila Krager, Cameron Inglis, Dan Dobson, Harry Smith, Murph90210, Jibba, Robert Major, and Aces Punk. Guys, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next one.